Years ago, I was invited by a good friend of mine named Jeff to go to the Timber Processing and Energy Expo in Portland, Oregon. And if you knew what that was, you would have just gone, ooh. Maybe you do know what it was, but but this, for me, that's what it was. It was like, oh, really? I get to go to this. My friend Jeff was a sales guy for a company that worked in, he worked for a couple different companies while I knew him, but they made stuff out of wood, like in these big factories, and he was he was kind of a bigwig with the company. So he got all these tickets so that he could invite clients to come to this trade show and check everything out. And then he happened to have a couple of extra tickets, and so I got to go. And when I went there, it was huge. It was at the Rose Garden in Portland, which is a lot like the Denver. They have the event center and things like that. It's a huge trade show, and companies have all of their big. These huge tools there that do stuff in the lumber industry. And we just got to walk through and see all these demos of this stuff. Some of it was like, it was just enormous. I don't know how they set any of this stuff up in this room. It took quite a bit of time. But for instance, there was this machine whose job it is to take the bark off of a giant tree. And when I mean giant tree, the kind of tree that would take like 8 or 9 of us holding hands to get all the way around. And it had these claws, and they would just turn around, and it was just amazing. They turned this thing on like twice a day. They could only do it twice a day because it made so much noise and such a huge mess. And got to see this work. And they had these band saws that were just so big. I mean, the saw itself was this wide, and this huge band, it would just fly, and they could mill logs into boards with this band saw. And they had automatic saws that lumber would go through. It would scan it and like x-ray it and do all this stuff, and then this saw blade would come out that was like literally like this big around. It would come out and it would cut the board while it was flying down this conveyor belt so fast that you couldn't actually see it. You saw something happen, but you couldn't actually see it. I mean, it was just like zoom, zoom, and it would cut out all of the knots and the bad lumber and all this stuff after it had scanned it, and then it sends it flying down this conveyor belt, and then these arms come out and kick the board off the conveyor belt and put it into piles so everything is the right size in the right place. It was so cool. It was the most fun I'd had in a long time. Those were the really big tools. They also had all the regular size tools, and all these power tools. And I could afford exactly none of it. But the big tools were like, the biggest ones were like millions of dollars. And then there were some that were like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then there were a whole bunch that were tens of thousands of dollars. And some of them were hundreds of dollars. I got a T-shirt for free that day. It was sort of disappointing. I wanted to spend money so bad, but I didn't have any. And so when we got done watching everything and looking at all the stuff, we left we left that room, kind of went out in the hall. Jeff bought us a hamburger, and I went home. And it was a great day. I wanted all that I saw. I wanted it all. And that's the power of a demo. I don't know if you've ever, if you've been to a demo of anything lately. If you're shopping for a car dealers, they like, this is the power of a demo, right? What do they want you to do? They want you to try it out, right? Take a test drive. Here, why don't you look good in that car. Doesn't that feel good? You just drive yourself in and you take a ride and, put it through its paces and do all that stuff. I mean, the power of a test drive, right? It's amazing. Or if you're looking for a house, you got to go demo that house. You got to go, not not demo that house. You need a demonstration, right? You got to walk through it. You got to look at it. You got to open the cupboards and look at it and start. What they want is for you to start imagining yourself living in this house. And can't you just see it now? That's what some realtors will just be like, oh, can you just imagine having all your friends over while you're cooking dinner for them in this beautiful kitchen, right? It's the power of a demo, right? You got to be able to see yourself in those. Demos can be very, very, very powerful. And that's why we do this, right? That's why some of my favorite demos, I haven't seen this a whole lot lately. I think people just stopped doing this. When I was a kid, it happened all the time. Whenever my family, we would go to Grand Junction, and I remember when Sam's Club first opened. Any of you that old? You remember when Sam's Club first opened? They used to have demos. Remember? And like at the end of every single aisle, there would be somebody with a hot plate and food with a bunch of toothpicks sticking out. And it's like, hey, we stay here long enough, lunch is free. Right? You just get enough of this stuff. It's like, oh, yeah. Where are the plates? I can't find the plates. They're over on aisle 7. You can get 700 of them if you want. But they're demos because they know. You taste it, you're going to be like, way more likely to take that home, even though you weren't planning on getting that. And it's like, oh, shoot. Anybody who's ever been to a Sam's Club knows it's not hard to get you to buy something at Sam's Club that you weren't planning on buying, right? Sam's Club, I think, costs about $200 an hour, I'm guessing, to be in that store. It's about $200 an hour. They know this because demos, man, they're powerful. It is one of the most powerful tools that we can employ in things like this. I don't know about you, but I wonder if you've ever been surprised in your life when you saw something like maybe a young family with really well-behaved, really polite children. Has that ever happened to you? And you've just been like, wow. There's something about it, right? When children, do that whole please and thank you and yes sir and yes ma'am and just are polite out in public. Right? And you're like, whoa, wow. Sometimes we get surprised by this. Or an older married couple who only have wonderful things to say about each other and to each other. Right? When you see that, we kind of just go, oh man, isn't that sweet? Isn't that lovely? I like that. I want that. Or maybe someone going through a really difficult season in life. It happens, right? And every now and then we watch someone who goes through a really difficult season in life, but they do it with grace and with dignity, and maybe even the ability in those moments to care for other people around them. You've met people like this. You've watched people do this. And when it happens, we just kind of go, wow, I want that, right? Someone who shows up to help when you really need it most, just because they saw your need and cared. And you're like, man, thank you so much. When this happens, when we see a demonstration of this type of life, it's astounding, it's impactful. We respond to it differently than we respond to the norm, right? Sometimes we say or think something like, I wish more people were like that. Or maybe I wish I was more like that. Or I wonder how I can become more like that. because demos are powerful. They really are. We're going to look at a collection, actually, of scriptures today. I didn't put them all in the bulletin because I didn't, frankly, want to scare you. We're going to be looking at several. We're going to be looking at a passage in 1 Timothy. We're going to be looking at a passage in Titus and a passage in Peter. We're not going to be, digging everything out, and we're not going to be taking the big scenic tour like I normally would give you. But we're going to look at this, do a big picture look at these passages today. And so if you have your Bibles, I think actually this might be printed in your bulletin today. Not everything is, but you can look at we're going to look at the 1 Timothy passage first. 1 Timothy chapter 3, starting right at the beginning in verse 1. We're going to take that. There's two parts of this that looks where Paul is talking about elders, and then he's going to talk about deacons. Now, if I mentioned this earlier last week, we looked at Acts chapter 6. This is some time later. If you remember, in Acts chapter 6, this was the whole church. This one church in Jerusalem was the whole church on the planet. 100% of the Christians that existed were in this church. And then some things happened. There's some persecution came, and the church started moving. Everybody was like, it's time. It's clearly time to go back home, right? We got to get out of Jerusalem. And so Christians went to all these different towns, and then all of a sudden, we've got this multiplicity of churches. There are churches went from one to who knows. We're not even sure how many churches at that point, but they started to spread all over the region, all over the area. There were churches all throughout Judea. There were churches all throughout Asia Minor. They even think there were churches even as far and maybe in Rome itself at that point, or at least shortly thereafter. And so the church started growing. Now, when all these churches started spreading out, it wasn't one big church in Jerusalem. It was a lot of little churches all over the place. A lot of little churches. And so there were still only 12 apostles. And the apostles couldn't go and be at every church, didn't need to. And so what they started doing is they started developing elders. And there would be elders and there would be deacons at each of these churches. And so what Paul is doing at this point, it's been a while. Now we're decades in now, okay? And Paul is writing in each of these, Paul writes to Timothy and Paul writes to Titus, and then Peter in his first letter, 1 Peter, is also writing to the church and encouraging them in these, when it comes to elders and deacons and church leadership. So that's what's happening here. Inside of these letters to these two pastors, Titus and Timothy, Paul is writing encouragement and just kind of going through this big list. The whole letter is all this stuff. I want you to, don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget this. And it's just encouraging and all this. So that's where we're at, okay? And he's encouraging these things. So we're going to start 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. Paul writes, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer," I need a mute button. I'll try not to do that again. "Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the church of God, for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. So so he's just talking about elders. This is the primary list of qualifications for an elder. Pretty straightforward. At least most of it's pretty straightforward. We're going to take a look at a few of these things in just a moment, but we're just going to keep moving on. Okay, we'll come back to some of it. Could you imagine? I mean, we could take. I mean, he said so much in this. If we took just like a couple of these things a week, it would take us forever, right? To really get through and dig through all this. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to get into it all in detail. But let's just look at the big picture. He continues on. Now he's going to be shifting gears and talking about deacons. And so in verse 8 he says, "Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience." I will say this. Every time in the New Testament you get to the word mystery, we're always like, what in, it's like this, is there some sort of mystical thing going on here? No. This is a code word for the gospel. The mystery of the faith is the gospel of Jesus Christ, hidden in the Old Testament, revealed in the New Testament. It's the gospel, okay? Hold to the gospel of the faith, right? The mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Verse 10, "And let them also be tested first." Also, right? It's assuming you already knew that the elders have to be tested. So he's saying deacons also should be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Interesting, verse 11, he says their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Right? So here it is again. He's making this standard, saying this is the standard that deacons must live up to. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn over a couple of books. We're going to go to Titus. This is from Titus chapter 1. Paul's doing the same thing. He's writing. Titus is this young pastor that Paul he left behind on the island of Crete to pastor the church there, to teach them, to help them grow and just shepherd this congregation. So in Titus chapter 1, starting in verse 5, he begins to talk about this. He says, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So Titus is sort of like this itinerant, right? He's like traveling all over the place, overseeing a bunch, because you got to remember, this is early in the church's development. It's not like there's Bible colleges everywhere where people can get trained up and prepared to do all this stuff. They're just doing it on the fly. And so it's like, hey, we got all these churches. And so we got a pastor, this Titus guy, who's willing to do this job. He's traveling all over the place, teaching, encouraging, shepherding. And Paul says, one of your jobs is to appoint elders in every town, as I directed you. In verse 6 it says, "If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife." Is this starting to sound familiar, right? It's a little repetitive, but that's okay. We're just getting a big picture here. "And his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer as God's steward," oh, this is important, overseer is God's steward. We're getting multiple words for the same thing, right? A steward is a manager, a servant who's in charge of resources, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. Wow. I mean, you read that and you're like, whew, that's Top Gun, right? So this is what Paul is doing. He's saying this is a high standard. And that's kind of what, when we read it, that's kind of what happens, right? We read this and like, ooh, this feels like this is a high standard, right? We're looking for pretty, maybe, depending on, I mean, I imagine Titus was like, I'm looking for some rare people. All right. We're going to turn over to Peter. In his epistle, the first letter that Peter wrote that we have, 1 Peter, in chapter 5, he does sort of the same thing, although he doesn't give the same type of list. You can tell this is definitely okay. Sorry about this. My iPad just did something it's never done before. Fixed it. Peter, you can definitely tell it's a different author because this is, I mean, a totally different track, totally different way to approach this. But these are Peter's words, his words of encouragement to the church. He says, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. Kind of amazing that he puts it this way. He's an apostle. But he doesn't say, I exhort you as an apostle. He's not using the biggest stick he's got, right? He's saying, I'm one of you as a fellow elder. Ooh, super humble. And a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Here's his charge. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. Being examples to the flock. Well, these are the main passages in the scriptures that outline for us in pretty clear detail what it means or what it looks like to be an elder, to be a deacon. And so these things are very important. I want for us, though, to think a little bit about this, to think kind of deeply about this, and just do a little bit of analysis today. Because maybe when you read through this, if you're just reading through the book of Titus, you're looking for like, where are those nuggets that I need to take into my heart? Where are those things that really apply to me? And you get to this part about elders and deacons, and you're thinking, well, that's not for me. I'm not an elder, I'm not a deacon, and maybe if you're a woman, you're like, well, I certainly don't need to pay attention to the elder stuff, right? Because elders are men. And by the way, before we get too far away from that point, so often people come to me, women have come to me and said, why is it that women can't be elders in this church? And is we just a bunch of chauvinists around here, or what's going on with this? And I always ask a couple of questions. I'm like, well, let's see. Here's what the scriptures say. I mean, Paul talks specifically every single time in scriptures when they talk about elders. Some of you are going, boy, he's wading out into it now, isn't he? Woo. No, listen, this isn't about me. This isn't about my take. This is about what the scriptures say. And the scriptures, every single time Paul talks about elders, he talks about men. And so the question is, why do you think he does that? Do you really think that Paul is like, men have to be elders because they're so much smarter than women? I'm glad you said that. No, that's kind of ridiculous. That's kind of ridiculous. Nowhere in all of the scriptures does it say that men are just better leaders naturally. They're just born better leaders. They're just born smarter. They're born more organized. They're, whatever. All of it, we start looking at that and we start going, no. I mean, I haven't done any scientific experiments on this yet, but I'm old enough to know that's not how it's, that's not the writing on the wall. And actually, I think Scripture is very clear about, Paul talks about the fall, and he talks about, Adam and Eve in the garden, and then an analysis of all that's going on here is, Paul even says, he can go so far as to say, men are to do this because it was Eve who was deceived. And sometimes we go, oh, well, it was Eve. Maybe she was dumber. And if that's your takeaway, you're not thinking hard enough. Because that says something about Adam without saying it, isn't it? What does it say? Adam wasn't deceived. He sinned willingly. There was some obstinance about it. Eve acted outside of her partnership with Adam. She acted independently. But Adam acted passively. He acted indifferently. Like he was just sitting there watching the whole thing go down. God had personally said to Adam, if you look at the record, what it says is that Adam was given his instructions, and then it says God made Eve. So Eve knew because Adam told her. Adam knew because God told him. You are to, he specifically uses the word, your job is to subdue creation. And then all of a sudden, they're in the Garden of Eden, and his wife is being tempted by part of creation. And Adam should have gotten up and subdued it, broke a branch off of that oak tree and beat that snake to death. That's what should have happened, because men, our jobs are to lop off the heads of the enemies of God. And that's a different sermon, but read the Bible. It's in there. It's a good book. There's some real cool stuff in there. But that's not what happened. Adam was passive, and scriptures are saying, men, no more of that. This is actually, the call to this leadership is actually restoring a right order that was there in creation, that God had set up in creation. The reason God calls men to leadership is because otherwise men would sit back on the couch and watch their wife work till the sun went down. And it's true. Lived experience. We don't have to do a scientific experiment here. Lived experience says it's true. Sorry, guys. I'm just telling the truth. Now, it's not true for everybody. Some of us, we need to learn. This is a character development issue. Guys, one of the things I think one of our goals ought to be is to serve our wife. This is to love our wife like Christ loved the church. This is Ephesians chapter 5, if you need to go look it up again, and to lay our life down. That's real spiritual leadership. And this is what God is calling men to. Now, listen, the scriptures are not saying women have no place of service in the church. Far from it. You've heard me say this before. If it weren't for women, there wouldn't be a church. But men need to step up. And this is the command. We just need to look at it in a different perspective, not so much our cultural the norms of our culture and the battles that we're facing. We tend to do that. We tend to write things into that. And so that's why it's so important to take a look at this. Now, I have a couple of slides that I want to show you. The first one is sort of a composite of all that we just read about the requirements for being an elder, okay? Let's take a look at this. Here we go. This is what all the passages that we read, this is sort of grouped together. And so we have, a list of things that relate to personal character. That's the biggest list. And then we have over here, we have things that relate to leadership, ability. And then we have things that relate to motive. And all of those things, this is what it speaks to. So we have, above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-control, respectable, hospitable, upright, holy, disciplined, hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught. That's the mystery that's mentioned also. Well thought of by outsiders, examples to the flock, not a drunkard, not violent, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, not recent convert, not arrogant, not quick-tempered, not domineering. All of these things. We see a lot of character inside of here. These are character issues. We look at some of those, and maybe most of those are pretty clear. I think we can read that and just say, there are a couple that are kind of, you read that and you're kind of like, that's weird. Like the second one, husband of but one wife. Anybody have two wives here? Nobody's going to raise their hand anyway. Listen, here's the weird thing. We tend to grapple with this a little bit in our culture because it's like, well, what is that supposed to mean? It can't mean polygamy, right? Because that's terrible. So, is he talking about divorce here? Is he talking about all this? And here, the problem is we try to read this with, 2025 eyes instead of understanding it in the date that Paul is writing. Listen, have you read the Old Testament? There's a lot of polygamy going on. Have you noticed? And have you noticed all the times that God spoke from heaven and said, stop doing that? No, I haven't noticed. I mean, if there was ever an opportunity, there's this guy, you've probably heard of him, his name is Solomon in the Old Testament. That dude had so many wives. I mean, I don't know how he made it. Right? I mean, it's insane. If there was ever a time that God would send a prophet to say, what are you doing, you moron? This might have been it, but no. We read in the Old Testament of Levites who have more than one wife. We read of every king more than one wife. It seems like the richer you are, the more wives you have, and everybody's like, well, that's practical, right? If you're gonna, what is going on here? Why does God not take a stand against this in the Old Testament? And in the New Testament, it's interesting that this is the only thing about it in the New Testament. Sort of. It's the clearest. Elder should be husband of one wife. Now, just by a show of hands, how many of you think that ethic really only applies to elders? Anybody? Isn't that interesting? None of us think it's a good idea for everybody else. Just elders. As a matter of fact, it was a matter of law. I mean, in that time, in that day and age, it was just like, no, this is not against the law in almost any culture. It wasn't against the law for Israelites, but there were rules, there were things that surrounded it, and all of those rules that were in the scriptures that we can open, all of those rules existed to protect women and children. Makes sense, doesn't it? What happens if you don't protect women and children? Well, we know this for sure, that this type of the ethic that rejects this, where men can marry as many women as they want and can divorce as many women as they want, usually works out pretty bad for women and really, really bad for children. And we've kind of come to realize this, and there is no quarter in all of the scriptures for men who mistreat women and children. As a matter of fact, Jesus speaks, we see how Jesus speaks to the religious leaders of his day that are leading people away from the scriptures, leading people away from the truth. But when he speaks of people that hurt children, take advantage of children, he said, it would be so much better if that person had a millstone tied around their neck and was thrown into the deepest part of the ocean. You're going to wish that's what happened. That's all that happened. Jesus takes this real seriously. So here's the thing. Here's what we know. Is that me? No, it's you. Here's what we know. This is there because husband of one wife is what is the absolute best for women and for children. When this happens, good things happen. And now what you can do is go back in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and find every place it didn't happen, and just see how good it was. See how great it was. The relationships that children had with their mothers and fathers and with one another. Man, it was a mess in almost every circumstance. Almost every circumstance. All right, so that's one. There's a few other weird ones in here, like hospitable. Elders are supposed to be hospitable. Is anybody like, you see that and you're like, okay, that one, that's clearly reserved for elders, right? It's a good thing no one else has to be hospitable. You're starting to see where I'm going here, aren't you? There's nothing on this list. Like, who's exempt from pursuing holiness? Anyone? I mean, just women? Maybe women, because women can't be elders, right? So they're out. No, it's silly, right? We're getting silly when we start looking at this. All this stuff. I love that word, the one here, not violent but gentle. Not violent but gentle. I like this one just because I really like, if you read this in the KJV, it says, not pugnacious. Isn't that a great word? You're like, I don't even know what that is. But it's such a great word, right? Not pugnacious. Well, you do know what it is because it's translated here as not violent. It actually comes from the same word we get pugilist. You know what a pugilist is? Anybody? A boxer, right? A pugilist. We don't call them anymore. Anybody gonna watch the pay-per-view pugilist thing? It's a boxing match. This is a fighter. This is somebody who likes to pick fights. Somebody who's just, and it's just like, okay, we definitely don't want that person in the eldership, right? I've heard stories from other pastors about when they went to a church and it was couple times a month, there were some guys that were just pugnacious, and they would be having these conversations. They'd get so heated that they'd invite one another out into the parking lot, and they would actually have a brawl in the parking lot. There were neighbors that would go, and they knew when the elders meeting was, and so they would make sure they would have their friends over, they would buy beer, and they would watch the fight in the church parking lot. That's like we're laughing a little bit so that we don't cry, right? Because we're like, that's insane. That's the worst I've ever heard, but I've heard some really bad stories. We don't need pugnacious. But listen, we don't just not need pugnacious. I just love saying that word. It's not just like we don't want that in the elders meetings. We don't want that. Period. No one is exempt from this. And this is what I want you to see. This is all of these things in here. Not domineering. Remember when Jesus was with his disciples? I like to talk about this a lot. Jesus was with his disciples, and they're like, who's going to be the best, right? Who gets to sit at your right hand and left? Who's the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus is like, the one of you that's servant of everyone. That's the one who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You see how the leaders of the Gentiles lord it over those that follow them, right? Over those they're in charge of. Not so with you. That's not how it's going to work. It's not about leverage. It's not about, might makes right. That is not how any of this stuff is going to work. And whenever, every single time we see the church violating this principle, we see people scorning the church. Because, friends, nobody needs that. Nobody. We don't need to be domineering. He talks about leadership ability. I think it's fascinating that whenever, in all of these things, when we look at it, when it talks about their management ability, their leadership ability, he just says, look at their family. You don't need to go to their workplace. Because the true you is the you at home, right? And it doesn't matter what's on your resume, what's on your kids' faces, what's on your wife's face. Ooh, this is where it really matters. This is the most important. This is the character we're looking for. And so just look at home. It doesn't matter how big of a company, how much money you make, all this other stuff. How do you treat your wife? How do you treat your kids? It's super important. Super important. But listen, it applies to everybody. All right, let's just because we got to, let's go to the next slide. This is the deacon ones. Kind of the same thing. Let's look at it. Dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain, holds to the mystery of faith, tested before serving, husband of one wife, manage their children and household well. Deacons' wives, he mentions deacons' wives because that's what we call a deaconess. Deacons' wives, because their service is together. When they serve the needs of the body or the community, they serve together. And so it matters, right? It matters. Dignified, not slanderous, sober-minded, faithful. Not a huge, long list, but it begins with a likewise, which means in the same way, to the same measure. Here's what I need you to see. Because maybe you might be just a little bit tempted to say, this stuff really doesn't have anything to do with me. That's not the right takeaway. As a matter of fact, let's get to that. I got 3 principles that I want to share from all of this, okay? 3 principles. And that is, principle number 1, I am called to Christ-likeness. Every single person in this room, if you belong to Jesus, if you've given your life to him, saved by Christ, then you are called to Christ-likeness. You are called in a Christ-word direction in your life, and we are all to be pursuing Christ, his character in our lives, so that every day we become more like him. We become Christ-like. It doesn't happen like that. It's going to take your whole life, but that's what our calling is. I am called to pursue Christ-likeness. Romans 8:29 says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Conformed to the image of his Son. That you and I would be conformed, reshaped, rebuilt, recreated into the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. It doesn't matter who you are. We are all called to Christ-likeness. that's what this list is, right? When we start looking at this, we're like, this is a description of Jesus. The New Testament is full of them. We love to read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, right? We start reading that love is patient, love is kind, we see that and we're like, wow, that is not me, but it definitely is a description of Jesus. And here's the thing, this is the goal of the Holy Spirit in your life, to make you into Jesus. You're being recreated from the inside out into the image of Christ, because it's your calling. It is God's agenda in your life. If you were ever wondering, what's God's agenda in my life? What's his primary agenda in your life? It's not to make you rich. It's not to, make you popular. It's not to make you super smart. It's to make you like Jesus. Anything else good that happens is a byproduct of the Holy Spirit's working in your life. We are first and foremost called to pursue Christ's likeness. Number 2, there's not a variety of standards for various Christ followers. There's not a variety of standards for various Christ followers. There's one standard. And the standard isn't a what, it's a who. We just talked about this. The standard is Christ. All of us are called to the same standard. This standard isn't just for preachers. It isn't just for pastors, for elders. By the way, those same word, those are interchangeable. Pastor, elder, shepherd. That's not what it is. It's not just for those radical, like Jesus freak types. It's for everyone who follows Jesus. Everyone. This is for the saved. This is the standard. Now, listen, it's not a standard. It's not a standard of salvation. This is where we get tripped up. This is kind of where the paths divide, if you will, because we are so focused on, what does it take to be saved? What is the standard of salvation? What do I got to do? And the gospel is very clear. You don't do salvation. Jesus does salvation. He did it. That's the whole point. Right? It's spelled D-O-N-E, not D-O. He's already accomplished your salvation. When you put your faith in him, by grace, you are saved. But you are not yet made right or righteous, except that he has imbued his righteousness upon us so that we can stand before God as righteous. But he is still doing a work in you. You were saved. We talked about this. We're going to do this again, right? We were saved. That's justification, right? The judges ruled not guilty. And we are being saved. The indwelling of the Holy Spirit and the ongoing work of sanctification in our life is this current tense idea of salvation. We are being saved. And then one day we will be glorified. We will be saved when he returns. And he will make us, and we will see him like he is. And he will make us like him. We can shed this sinful nature that we have and this battle that we are in. All the days of our lives will be over. Hallelujah. But this is how it works. So we're not talking about the standard of salvation. That's Jesus. He took care of that. What we're talking about is the Christward call, the heavenward call that he has in our life of us becoming like Christ. That he's the standard. There's not a variety of standards. One standard for elders, one standard for everybody else. Principle number 3. I am, no matter who you are, no matter what role you fill, no matter if you have an office in the church or not, I am first and foremost an ambassador for Christ. Every single one of you, on the day you get saved, if you are 14 years old and you put your faith in Jesus, You are an ambassador for Christ. If you're 99 years old and you finally give yourself to Jesus, on that day, you become an ambassador for Christ. Listen to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. This is our call, right, to the lost. Be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Oh, that would make such a great song, wouldn't it? I just love that, what he's talking about there. This is so inside out and so backwards. He who knew no sin became sin, so that we who are such sinners would become the righteousness of God. How do we become the righteousness of God? By becoming more like Christ. He is making us new. He is making us perfect. He is recreating us. He is causing us to become a new creation, therefore, sons of God and daughters of God. Oh, listen, this is huge. This is mind-blowing, right? When he writes this list, he is actually saying this is all of our target. It doesn't matter if you'll ever become one of these office holders in the church. This is what it means to follow Christ. Elders just need to be people who can demonstrate, who have been transformed by this, because it's such an important role. You're going to be leading. You serve as an example of the church. Peter, let's just go back to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3. Not domineering over those you charge, but he says, being examples to the flock. Examples to the flock. What is the point of being an example to the flock? The point is the flock can follow. And that's what flocks do, right? They follow. This is the whole point. We're in this together. Look, there's been a great deal of speculation over the past decades about the decline of the Western church. It used to be, reading about it, every once a week there's a new article about why things are so bad in the church and why there's so many people flooding out of the church. And it's interesting that just in the last, these things are hard to measure because it takes time, but what we've seen is this decades-long decline of church attendance, of church membership. And then for a while it was like everybody was talking about the nuns, not the N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S. And the idea is like these are the people who have no affiliation whatsoever. Done. I'm out. And so we read about this stuff. What it's going to take. How do we stop this? Well, interestingly, in just the last couple of years, it seems like maybe we'll know soon, but it looks like we've kind of hit the floor. It's not continuing to go down now with a couple of years. It's not continuing to decline like it was. It's actually plateauing a little bit. So it's like everybody who's jumped ship, who's going to jump ship, at least at this point, right? That's what the statistics seem. And everybody's like guessing. There's a lot of people that are prognosticating and guessing and doing all this stuff about why are so many people leaving the church? Why are so many churches closing? And so on and so forth. And there's so many different takes on this, and it's so hard to keep them straight, and I don't even want to talk about them because that's not the point of today. But I will say this. I mean, we're not doing children's ministry right. We're not doing youth ministry right. Not enough men's ministry. Not enough this ministry, that ministry. We don't have enough school buses, right? We don't have enough lasers and fog machines. I probably don't need to tell you how I feel about that. Our worship is too shallow. The church is not attractional enough. Or it's way too attractional. All this says to me is, I'm not sure if most have any idea why anything is anything. I mean, it just looks like utter confusion. One conference I attended some years ago, there were two speakers at this conference. It was just for pastors and elders, and I had to drive down to, it was in New Mexico, and a couple of these pastors were flown in from somewhere. I can't even remember who they were. And the first guy got up to speak, and he said, we're driving people out of our church, and if you're a preacher, you need to, you shouldn't preach more than 20 to 25 minutes. And you know how I feel about that already. If you preach more than that, people won't come. You're doing great. The next guy, literally the very next guy, gets up and said passionately, we need to do a better job of fearlessly teaching God's word to anyone who will listen. And I was like, wow, what a day. We have been from one side to the other. Here's what I think we've forgotten. Not really, but kind of, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Jesus said that. He didn't say, I need you guys to build this church. Here are the blueprints. Here's all this, I need you to build my church. Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Maybe we just need to remember who God is, who we are, what we are for, and just be the church. We look at this now. I don't know if you feel this. I feel this. When I look at these things that we had up here on the wall, I look at that and I'm like, wow, these are high standards. They're high standards. But listen, we shouldn't be surprised. Yes, the standard is high. The standard is Jesus. That's who we're following. That's who we're emulating. And friends, that doesn't mean that we have to be perfect like Jesus was perfect. He took care of this. We all understand. He knows, Scripture says, He knows who we are. He made us out of dirt. He's not under any illusion that, we're made of some, more special dirt than anyone else. But here's the thing. Whenever we see the church demonstrating Jesus to the world, we see the world moving toward Jesus. It's not when we're demonstrating how tough we are, how good we are, how whatever we are. That doesn't accomplish much at all. But when we're demonstrating Jesus to the world, we see the world moving toward Christ. This is why this standard is the way it is. And friends, I'm telling you, what Delta needs, what Western Colorado needs, is people who are committed to aiming their life Christward and becoming like Him and emulating Him in every area of their life, not just on Sundays, but all the time, pursuing Christ fearlessly, hard, that we might demonstrate Him to this world. It's almost St. Patrick's Day. It's coming up real soon. I absolutely love this prayer. It's been mentioned here before, but the prayer of St. Patrick. In his in his pursuit, this guy got it. He got it. This is it. Ready? Christ in me. Christ before me. Christ behind me. Christ in me. Christ beneath me. Christ above me. Christ on my right. Christ on my left. Christ when I lie down. Christ when I sit down. Christ when I arise. Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me. Christ in the mouth of every one who speaks of me. Christ in every eye that sees me. Christ in every ear that hears me. Here's a guy that understands the power of a demo. Whenever we see the church demonstrating Jesus to the world, we see the world moving toward Jesus. I mentioned last week that we're going to be doing some training on this stuff, and I literally said, if you can imagine ever in your life, maybe not right now. If you're 12, you can come to this. If you can imagine ever in your life serving the church in the role of deacon or elder, why not start prepping for that now? Listen, I'm not saying it'll ever happen. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know this: if every single one of us in this room were qualified, we're following Jesus like this, what would you imagine God doing through that kind of church? Ooh. That's how movements get started, you know. Let's follow hard after Jesus like that and watch him